Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this event today. My name is Mike Anderson. I'm an executive at Saab, as well as a board director here at the Atlantic Council. So good to see so many of you here, and welcome to those who are online. On behalf of Saab and the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, as well as its Forward Defense Program, I would like to welcome you to this exciting first installment of our 2024 Commander Series titled A Conversation with General Sir Jim Hockenhull on an Innovative UK Strategic Command. General, thank you so much for being with us today. A little bit about the Commander Series. When Saab and the Atlantic Council first launched the Commander Series in 2009, our vision was to establish a flagship speakers forum for senior military leaders to discuss the most important security challenges both now and in the future. This series has been very useful for companies like Saab, helping us to better understand challenges and priorities in order to inform our investments and partnerships, particularly when it comes to research and development, while better preparing ourselves to meet future capability needs. Today's event is the first installment of the Commander Series this year. Looking back on a very successful year in 2023, we had the honor of hosting Commander of the U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, for a conversation on the security challenges facing Latin America. Commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe and Air Force Africa, General James Hecker, to discuss the future of U.S. and Allied air power in the European and African theaters. We also had Secretary of the U.S. Air Force Frank Kendall here for a conversation on the Air and Space Force imperatives for strategic competition, and the U.S. Chief of Space Operations, General Chance Saltzman, who discussed his theory of success for deterring conflict and promoting long-term stability in the space domain. And most recently, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Admiral Christopher Grady, as he outlined his long-term vision for implementing the 2023 Joint Warfighting Concept. I would also like to take this opportunity to announce our next guest speaker on the Commander Series. On May 7th, we have the honor to host Supreme Allied Commander Europe, SACEUR, General Christopher Cavoli. But today, we look forward to kicking off the 2024 series with today's event. General Hockenhull, thank you again for spending time with us today. Very pleased to have you here. I'm looking forward to hear your perspectives on an innovative UK strategic command. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce General James Cartwright, who will further introduce our guest speaker and moderator. General Cartwright is a board director at the Atlantic Council and also served as the 8th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff within the U.S. Department of Defense. He has a distinguished career serving in the U.S. Marine Corps for 40 years before retiring from service in 2011. This included service as a commander of U.S. Strategic Command prior to serving as Sir Vice Chairman. General Cartwright also serves as an advisor for several corporate entities, providing innovative technical and policy advice. Please welcome General Cartwright to the stage.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. It probably goes without enough fanfare that your company and you in particular have led this activity. It's been one of the most successful activities at the Council, and it always draws a good audience. And it goes well beyond the company. Mike's efforts here, both on the board and in these individual sessions, brings just a wealth of experience and knowledge. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our discussion today with our distinguished guest, the Commander of the United Kingdom Strategic Command, Sir Jim Hockenhull. Strategic Command being, two different kinds of strategic command here, so we can have that conversation a little bit later. I'd really enjoy it. I would also like to thank the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's Forward Defense Program for hosting this timely event. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by the General as the Commander of Strategic Command, formerly Joint Forces Command, manages all the allocated joint capabilities from across the UK's 3 armed services. It takes the lead on joint warfare development, learning from lessons and experimentation to advise on both how to currently operate and how to think about the future and the capabilities that are going to be required for the service in general. Warfare today across all the domains is intensified through the emerging technologies. It is an imperative for the United States and the United Kingdom and our allies to innovatively adopt these technological advances to maintain a joint warfighting advantage over any adversary. And in the green room, we had a long conversation about how to think about integrating the commercial sector into our capabilities and how we think about the future and what they bring to the table. And I found it interesting that we kind of both came to the same conundrum, that 99% of this problem, we've already bought the force. So how do you start to integrate a force that's already there, bring it up to the future, et cetera? That has a whole set of challenges. And we're running another program here at the Atlantic Council. And one of the things we've kind of stumbled on is that it's not the adoption side of the equation that's the problem. Or I'm sorry, it's not the innovation side, it's the adoption side. How do you bring the force along for all of these types of things? A simple change in software can get to 2 million people in a heartbeat. Training individuals takes a lot longer, and we've got to start to marry the two up and figure out how it's going to work, and I'm hoping that you'll have some insight for us and solve that problem today. Looking forward to the NATO summit in Washington, General Hockenhull will discuss the current and future threat environments that the UK Strategic Command, along with allies and partners, must prepare for. He will share his vision for the joint force warfighting given the global threat and context, and how the defense industry can support technological transformation. As commander of UK Strategic Command, the General oversees the integration of warfighting capabilities in UK forces as well as cooperation on capabilities with allies and partners. He has a distinguished career serving as the Chief of Defense Intelligence for the UK directly prior to this appointment as Commander of Strategic Command in 2022. He served in joint appointments for the vast majority of his career, including 10 years on operational tours. Interviewing him will be Clementine Starling. And she's the Director of Forward Defense here in the Atlantic Council. She shapes the Scowcroft Center's U.S. Defense Research Agenda and produces thought leadership on U.S. security strategies and the evolving character of warfare. Okay, I'm a Marine. That's a technical way of saying she gets things done. Okay. Before I turn it over to the General and Clementine, I would like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record. We encourage our audience online to direct any questions to General Hockenhull using the Ask AC feature. Thank you. Clem?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jim, and I work in Strategic Command, the UK Strategic Command. I am reminded every time that anyone gives a resume of my career that I'm closer to that being an obituary rather than an introduction. And I've had a long career in the military that's lasted about 40 years. I was only 7 when I joined, so but in that 40 years I've seen a lot of changes, having joined at the time of the Cold War and then gone through a shift in the way in which we operated through counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations, and now back to the sort of challenges we face today. I'm an intelligence officer by background, and I describe myself as an accidental general. I never expected, nor did many others, that I would reach such a position. But I think there's a real sense of both opportunity but also obligation that comes as a consequence of being in a leadership position in any of our nation's militaries at this particular time, with the scale of the challenges that we face. As I operate my function, I think it's important that we do so with some humility. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to come and answer everybody's questions and give you insight which is going to be so clear and decisive that those problems will melt away. As I said to one of my staff, that I said I was trying to act with some humility and he suggested that I had quite a lot to be humble about, which I thought was good, that I'd encouraged an open environment where he could feel that he could comment in such a way. UK Strategic Command is absolutely not US Strategic Command. In fact, the one thing I definitely don't do in UK defence is anything to do with our nuclear enterprise. That rather defines us in some different ways. But the UK Strategic Command holds what I believe are the jewels in the crown of UK defence. So I am responsible within my organisation for our permanent joint headquarters, which is our single global COCOM. We don't have any challenges in integrating our combatant commands because we only have one. That means they've got quite a lot to do, but it does mean that integrating that command is relatively straightforward for me. But I'm also responsible for our Defence Intelligence Enterprise. That Defence Intelligence Enterprise forms the UK version of not just the DIA, but also the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, elements of other agencies, as well as some cyber responsibilities. I also have the UK Special Forces under my command. I have our National Cyber Force, which is the UK's national offensive cyber capability, which we operate in partnership with GCHQ, our equivalent of NSA. Too many letters, but for the cognoscenti, you'll know what I mean. I also have responsibility for our Defence Digital Enterprise, so all of Defence's digital capability, including our cyber defence, to mirror my offensive cyber responsibilities. I look after defence support and logistics to make sure we're enabling the force effectively. The Defence Medical Services, again, to ensure that that enablement is done across the force. And I also look after our overseas bases and our overseas footprint, so including Cyprus, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, Diego Garcia, and some other locations. So I've got a set of joint capabilities, and my initial function is to make sure that we integrate internally in our organisation a lot of strong organisations which are strong verticals, but making sure that we're looking across those organisations to get what I refer to as the power of combinations. And we've made great strides in the last 2 years about trying to make sure that we're able to utilise those capabilities in partnership rather than perhaps having them in competition. We do this in our work through kind of 3 themes. And we look at campaigning, at driving integration, and leading the cyber domain. And in campaigning, this is where I think perhaps a shift from a traditional approach of thinking about operations as being contingent on a transition to a crisis or a crisis itself, but recognizing that we need to have consistency and persistence around our operations, that we need to make sure we're prioritizing our capabilities both within and across a variety of campaigns where demand is placed upon us, and that we do those campaigns in partnership with others. And if we're going to work in partnership with others, then we need to make sure that we're sufficiently integrated to assure that we can actually operate, function together, and achieve some degree of interoperability. We drive integration. This is often done. Integration needs driving because it doesn't naturally happen. We have strong silos in all of our defence organisations. We need to have strong Army, Navy, Air Forces, Cyber Forces, Space Forces, or the Coast Guard, or the Marines, or whatever construct any nation has around their armed forces. They need to be strong. But they also need to recognise that there are cross-cutting capabilities where either we need to drive that integration either for increased operational effect, or sometimes to drive efficiency to ensure we're getting the right return on investment, and sometimes just to make it easier to operate. The more integrated we can be nationally, then I hope that means we can then look and with our international partners and try and achieve certainly some interoperability and maybe some integration with our international partners. We also lead the cyber and electromagnetic domain, and I'll come back to, I think, the importance of that domain in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, but also other conflicts currently. What I would say, though, is that my cyber operators, my defensive cyber operators, are engaged with our nation state and other non-state actor adversaries on a daily basis. And they are engaged more frequently with those adversaries than any other part of my force. And we should recognize that in our cyber and EM domain, there is already a contest going on, and we may be in a different phase of operations in the cyber domain than perhaps we believe we are in other domains. Within all of this, the relationship with the United States is absolutely vital. I have 100 of my personnel permanently here in the United States, embedded with partner organizations led by a brigadier general. And we have an equivalent number embedded in my teams in the UK. And there's something definitely, as the General said in his introductory remarks, we can try to integrate by directive, we can try to integrate by technology, but ultimately it comes down to people. It comes down to how we do this, how we understand each other. I had the great opportunity to be an instructor at the Command and General Staff course in Leavenworth, and then to teach at the Naval Postgraduate School. There were many, many times, perhaps much like today, where my students or an audience looked at me and said, I have little understanding of what you are saying, because we perhaps have sometimes a barrier in our understanding of what we mean by particular terms and phrases. We've got to break down barriers. We can't assume that we understand each other and that we're going to work together effectively. It's got to be an effort. This is not easy. Our natural state of doing things is to, when things get difficult, is to narrow your vision and narrow your boundaries. And we've got to find a way of enabling people to move differently. And that means it's not just technology, but it is experimentation. It's about our concepts. It's about our doctrine. It's about our exercising together and the way in which we're going to prepare. What I would say around the future fight is that the one thing we're going to be short of is time. And on lots of military operations that I've deployed in my career, we've gone into the conflict with the force we had, and then we've had quite a lot of time to adjust that force as we've gone through those operations. So we've had kind of some learning while doing, and that's enabled us to then prevail in many of those situations. I would argue that future conflict, we may well be very short of time, and therefore the time to adapt is now. There is an opportunity now to change this paradigm and not hope that we can wait until the conflict itself. I've been asked to talk a little bit about Russia, Ukraine, and I'm sure we'll come back to this in discussion. There are lots of lessons coming out of Ukraine, and if you squint hard enough, you can learn any lesson that you want from Ukraine, and pretty much everybody is. That is, I think there are times where we're subject to biases, whether it's confirmation bias or availability bias, where we look at things and it confirms our thesis. And I think we need to be really rigorous about what we're learning. There are some things, I think, which are themes that are coming through, and we'll perhaps explore these in discussion around precision, a dispersed battlefield, the impact of electronic warfare and how that's changing some of the paradigm of operations, lessons around uncrewed systems and stockpiles. But there's definitely something coming through to me around how our capability is being much more software defined and becoming more hardware agnostic. That's not to say the hardware isn't important, because it is, but recognizing that our ability to adapt capability is here now, and I think that opportunity is going to expand in the future. But I would caution with those lessons in Ukraine that to not fall into the trap of thinking that future conflict is going to be like the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine and the conflict that has come as a consequence. I think we need to be open to the idea that is an example of a type of warfare, but the war that we may well be called upon to fight, which could be in a variety of different locations, I think it's informed by what's happening in Ukraine, but it shouldn't be defined by what's happening there. And we need to make sure we've got the intellectual purity of thinking about these things in a broader way. We should also watch that we're not the only ones learning. Lots of people are watching the conflict in Ukraine and learning. Some are learning at distance. The Russians are learning in conflict, and whilst they were perhaps slow to learn in the early part of the campaign, it is very clear that they are learning and adapting far more quickly now. I think we do need to make sure that we are watching out for what that next crisis will look like, but I think much like I think the F. Scott Fitzgerald quote of when asked how he went bankrupt, he said 2 ways, slowly and then very, very quickly. There is a risk that when we look at future conflict that we admire the problems and then suddenly we're still surprised. And I think we've got to do better at both thinking in conceptual terms, but also making sure that we've got the right indicators and warnings in place. Part of this, I think, is also how we work with industry, and I'm really grateful to Saab for the sponsorship of this series. And I think it's an example of how we should be thinking to change our relationship with industry. And I would propose that we need to think about shifting the boundary of how we think about national security. At the moment, we think of a national security boundary which includes kind of government organizations, including the armed forces, and then we have industry which is outside of that boundary, supplying capability over that boundary. That's broken down somewhat already because on the battlefield now, let alone the future, there are lots of contractors, there's lots of dependency on supply chains in order to sustain the warfighter. But my sense is we need to think about that operation as being much more of a partnership than a customer-supplier relationship. And I think that means we're going to have to redefine some of the ways in which we think about contracting, some of the things of the ways in which we think about shared risk between the force, the bureaucracy, and industry. And I think there's a big opportunity for us. We should recognize that our industrial base is one of our enormous strengths in terms of prevailing in a future conflict. And how do we make sure we're leveraging that to advantage whilst getting that industry partners to believe that the fight that we're making in order to sustain the rules-based international order is in everybody's interest, including industry, and therefore how do we make sure that that feels a more coherent approach? I think that the prospect of going warfighting is now more likely than at any time in my career. And we've been on small warfighting expeditions, but I'm talking about significant warfighting contingency. But whilst we need to look forward and make sure that we're using this time to ensure that we're appropriately prepared, we should also recognize that during that time, we are going to face information confrontation, we're going to be challenged in the cyber domain, we're going to be challenged in space, we're going to see threats posed to things like submarine fiber optic cables. So whilst we must make sure that we're preparing for what may be a worst case, we need to make sure we're dealing with not just the most likely, but the inevitable case of the challenge that we'll face in the immediate term. So we need that ability to be kind of dual focused. Often in defense organizations, we recognize something and we're very good at going after a particular problem. I think we need to be a bit better at understanding nuance and being able to balance across those challenges. And I'm sure we'll come in discussion to integration, but I kind of leave these remarks, I think, with a closing thought that I believe it is entirely possible, indeed likely, that you can go faster alone. But I am completely convinced that we've got the opportunity to go further together. And if we follow that maxim, we have some opportunity for the future. Thank you.
So thank you so much, and a huge thanks to our in-person audience. It's great to see you all, and thanks to those online. We have about, I guess, 25 minutes for a conversation. So you put so much on the table there that I really want to delve into, and thank you, that was incredibly comprehensive. I am going to encourage our in-person and virtual audiences, please submit your questions and I'll try and get to as many as possible. It's askac.org. That's how you submit it. Members of our team will be sharing iPads around so you can submit questions. But sir, so I think the key message we want everyone to leave this event with is there is a distinct difference between UK Strategic Command and US Strategic Command. If that message has not hammered home for you yet, please make sure you remind it. So not nuclear, almost everything else. So the remit is massive. And really, as I was kind of preparing for this conversation and looking through all of your responsibilities of UK Strategic Command and yours as the commander, I don't envy you. It's a big job. So maybe let's start with kind of the core focus of UK Strategic Command, which is joint warfighting. Joint warfighting is really difficult. So how are you thinking about building and fighting as a joint force across all domains of warfare? You know, land, air, sea, undersea, space. And if you can you narrow in on your 1 to 2 priority areas to really enable joint all-domain warfighting? I know you have some specific initiatives for multi-domain operations, so would love to hear you focus in on that.
Thank you. So we have I think, a set of remarkable capabilities. I refer to them as the kind of jewels in the crown of UK defence. That annoys my single service chief fellows. If they're watching, I apologise, but it's true. And my remit, I think, is to recognise firstly that not everything has to be integrated. So this isn't a kind of universal maxim. This is about finding how do you amplify, how do you generate sort of compound effect by trying to drive the force closer together. I think it is true that in future operations we are always going to fight as a joint and integrated force, and that joint force is going to be in almost every circumstance that I can think of. It will be a multinational force. So integration is a kind of problem which is multiplied a number of times because you're trying to integrate nationally, and then you've got a series of international challenges. And therefore, if you're trying to do it, I think you need to recognise the essentials. To me, the first essential element of this is how do we make sure that we've got the right command and control capability to be able to go joint warfighting, and that joint warfighting is making sure that not only can we communicate and command and control, but how are we able to ensure that we can exploit any sensor on the battlefield, connect it to shooters on the battlefield? How do we make sure that we're able to operate at the kind of speed of relevance that the modern battlefield's going to ask of us? Now that's super difficult when you get to kind of international partnerships, because lots of people are buying lots of equipment from lots of different places, or they might not have a set of capabilities. And I admire the work that's being done by NATO ACT to try and look at this on an alliance level, and we're seeking to bring the kind of lessons that we've learned. But my sense is it's almost being kind of having two thoughts in your head simultaneously, which are mutually incoherent. I want to be ambitious, but I also want to be pragmatic, and I think some pragmatism in how we drive integration is really important. The other thing is you've got to be able to describe the benefits in a way which actually convince those that you're asking to maybe operate differently or do something differently, or maybe change their investment plan. They've got to be convinced of the benefits of this. So there's quite a lot of advocacy that's involved in all of this as well, and showing that things can be better. But we should all recognise that the sorts of threats that we may be confronted with in future, none of us will be able to do it alone. So the imperative to be able to operate in an effective coalition is going to be critical to success in these sorts of of ventures which were we to not succeed, it could change without sounding overly melodramatic, but it will change the future of the world if those conflicts are resolved in a way which aren't in line with our values and standards and supporting the rules-based international order. And therefore, this becomes not to me a series of choices. It becomes an imperative. We just need to be smart about the journey, how we get there.
Thank you. We have an audience question here. We've got a few coming in. So I don't actually know who's asked this. Please note your name so we can attribute the question to you. So this person asked, do you think combined joint all-domain command and control is achievable among the United States and its allies, or are capabilities at present limited to joint all-domain command and control by virtue of the massive complexity of any such system?
So, I mean, it is very, achieving that requires an enormous amount of complexity. But I think some of the lessons we need to draw from this is how do we import from outside of defense kind of best practice? We have whenever the military speak about anything, we tend to talk in a variety of different acronyms which make it impenetrable to anybody that doesn't speak kind of military Martian. And even when we speak to other nations, we use slightly different military anachronisms, military abbreviations, so it makes it super difficult. That we need to make sure we're not overcomplicating things when some of these problems have already been solved in what some people term the real world. And how do we import that sort of clarity into our business? So I'm not saying that provides a template solution or makes it easy, but I think we need to open our mind to the fact that many of the challenges we face are actively being solved and addressed, particularly by some of the big technology companies. And how do we make sure that we're bringing in kind of best practice in order to be able to do that? What we then need to do is to make sure that the challenge, I think, at the combined level of doing this across multiple nations is how do we try and find an easy way to make this work? If you make it hard, then and it's hard enough as it is when everyone's got a series of different legacy systems. How do we try and find a way of using the advent of advanced technology in order to make this easier? And I'd close by saying that yes, at the moment it looks really, really difficult. But I also believe that we're still in the early years of the digital revolution. In the ambit of my career, we've gone from kind of not really using very much information technology to being dependent upon it. But I think that the arc that I've lived through is going to be nothing compared to what we'll see in the next 3 to 5 years and certainly over the next decade. So where are those big opportunities for us to truly transform our capability? We need to make sure we're looking to the future as well as sort of living in the present.
Yeah.
And sometimes we only look at the future through the lens of today.
So on that capabilities point, so I was struck by many things that you said at the podium, but you reminded us we go into conflict with the force that we have, right? But the time to adapt is now. And we've talked about the need to adopt innovative technologies both on and off the battlefield, right? Because there are many ways in which technology can help. A lot of back office stuff that could be tremendously valuable. So what are a few of the key capabilities that you see being pivotal for the future UK Joint Force? What are you prioritizing?
So we are, I think, probably 3 or 4 areas. The first is what we refer to as our digital backbone, to try and make sure that we've got a coherent approach to our digital infrastructure across UK defence. We have previously bought things in silos, and then we've tried to integrate, and integrating after the fact is always expensive and sometimes not even possible. So how do we make sure we're driving a coherent digital backbone? We're prioritizing how we get after enhanced precision and utilization of advanced technology to help us be more precise. That precision is not just about buying very, very expensive precision weapon systems, but it's how do we make what were previously less discriminate, perhaps more dumb systems, really smart. That helps not just in terms of effect on the battlefield, but it also helps because you can reduce your sustainability challenge by potentially holding less artillery ammunition because you're guaranteeing a first or second round hit rather than firing lots of artillery rounds in order to strike a target that's placed within a particular geographic location. So enhanced precision is something I think that's very important to us. The third area I think is in our ISR capability, and making sure that we've got an ability to truly network that ISR capability, and that we're operating our ability to understand at pace. One of the lessons I think from Ukraine is the idea that the force on the battlefield is going to have to be more dispersed. I think deception, something of a lost art, is sort of coming back, and the idea that it sounds rather juvenile, but there may well be a battle of kind of hiding and finding on the future battlefield, and how do we make sure that we're gonna kind of win that fight? That also includes a sort of counter ISR effort to make sure that you can't be seen, and if you can be seen, making sure you can't be struck. Finally, I'd highlight the need to kind of transform our logistics support, and to one example, perhaps there are many in the area of support, but viewing energy as a capability, and recognizing that our approach of a force which consumes enormous amounts of energy, particularly true in the land environment, how do we make that force more agile and more dispersed, and where does that take us to? Is that small form nuclear reactors in order to generate localized energy, rather than having long columns of fuel tankers trying to deliver fuel to an armored force? And you can look in Russian operations in the early part of the invasion of Ukraine, how tied they were to the mobility assets and the logistic chain, and how do we kind of free the force? And there's a lot in there, and energy is but one example.
Thank you. So you've talked a lot about kind of data and digital transformation, and that's a big part of your remit. So what are your thoughts on how the future force needs to be structured and trained differently, given the value of data and new digital tools?
So I think in some ways we're going to need to look at some of our fundamentals. Our structure tends to be many levels of hierarchy in order to provide order and structure to what we do. I think there's a different set of opportunities. If we're able to service small groups or individuals on the battlefield with data and information to enable them to be able to act and respond differently, I think there's a fundamental shift. I think there are lots of lessons I see from my special force operators which are being pulled forward into the conventional force, and I think there's a lot of crossover between those sorts of capabilities. I also think there's perhaps not particularly answering your question, but a tangent perhaps. What we've also got to do is we've got to upskill the force. So if we're going to have a force which is going to be much more digitally enabled and data centric, then how do we make sure that we're training our force and exercising and experimenting with the force in order to change the way in which we're able to operate? Part of that is a remit we have in our kind of experimentation role, but also our kind of force development function, in order to make sure we're able to kind of think about that. But I do think it's back to we have a kind of triangle that we talk about in military capability of the moral, the physical, and the conceptual, and we need to make sure that when we think about data and technology, we're not just thinking about the kind of capability end of that, but actually there's a moral component to this in terms of our people, but there's also a conceptual element to this about thinking how we can do things differently.
Yeah. So there are many global demands for a future force, and you talked about war fighting is more likely, and we have conflict in Europe, we have conflict in the Middle East, heightening tensions in the Indo-Pacific. So how are you kind of looking at the globe? How are you considering what we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine, what's developing between Israel and Iran, proliferation of drone technology and what the Houthis are doing, through the lens of what the UK Joint Force needs to be able to do in the future, and where you think UK forces need to be placed in order to meet global challenges?
So I think the issue around these challenges is often that they're not discrete. There's a degree of kind of intersectionality across these challenges. So I think the first part of it is to make sure that we kind of think globally. When you look at Iran, you can look at Iran through a lens of what's happening in the Middle East. You can also look at Iran through a lens of its support to Russia and the impact that its capability is having on Russian ability to continue to attack Ukraine. So the first point I think is that trying not to get too narrow in your focus. These are either big regional or global actors, and therefore we need to make sure we're thinking in kind of global response. It's very easy to kind of narrow ourselves to, well, this is the crisis we think that will happen. And the only thing I think when you narrow your focus is you're going to get surprised. So there's something about keeping a sense of perspective. And I talk a lot about sort of trying to maintain the ability to operate at different focal lengths. It doesn't quite work because cameras don't do this anymore, of the lens kind of moving in and out. But for my generation, it definitely happened. It's not a myth. But that ability to kind of zoom in on a problem and then zoom out, but then move position, zoom back in again, come back out. You need the detail, but you also need the context and perspective. And sometimes we allow ourselves to be stuck at the wrong focal length. Either we're looking at it all too broadly and we don't understand the detail, or we get stuck at the detail element. And I think for the future force, it's we don't know yet where that particular challenge is going to be placed upon us. What we have got to do, though, I think, is recognise that in the context of potential future warfighting, how do we use the force we have in order to shape the world and to deter adversaries from moving us to a point where we end up in a warfighting space? So there's something about making sure that we're not supine in all of this. We've got to make sure that how we operate, how we train, how we partner, how we experiment, how we show our capability, all of that is not just about preparing for a conflict. It's also messaging and shaping and hopefully deterring our adversaries when they see the kind of, if we do achieve that sort of integrated force, then it's a deterrent on the basis that it's a far more difficult force in order to be able to defeat.
We have a question here from David Crawley with Ubiquity Robotics. David asks, what do you think the key insights are for how autonomous systems change the nature of warfare? Would you characterize the advent of these systems as a revolution in military affairs, as some may characterize it?
So I think, I'm not sure this is entirely true, but I'm going to say it anyway. So we use probabilistic language in intelligence. So I believe this is likely to be true, maybe even highly likely to be true. I think we're going through a sort of a reluctant revolution in military affairs. And that's because we get different signals over what we think the future might look like. Also, I think the military is a remarkable organization in its ability to adapt to solve problems, but its ability to confront big change actually isn't matched. We often say that the British military, and this may be true for others, that it's a remarkable organization when it goes on its operations. It can solve any problem and achieve almost anything. But when we're back in our home base, we become kind of overly bureaucratic and slow, and that we're not operating in the same way. So there's something to me about, if we are going to embrace the opportunity that comes with autonomy or with machine learning, or even as we adopt artificial intelligence and robotics, how do we conceive of that fundamentally change? And I think there's a process where we will begin. I think we're in the phase at the moment where we're thinking about how those technologies can augment what we do. But there's another level that goes beyond that, which is after augmentation, how do those start to transform other nature of our operations? And I think that's where our experimentation, and that needs to be done kind of jointly. It needs to be done with industry, and I'm really glad each time we do an experiment in the UK, I see more and more industry coming to those events. Not just the big companies, and it's important the big companies are there, but also a range of small and medium-sized enterprises that are bringing perhaps some more niche capabilities, perhaps like David's company. I don't know David's company. It may be huge. I may be doing him a massive disservice. But bringing those inside, and it's back to my earlier point of saying, can we change that boundary and recognize where, to coin a phrase, we're all in it together. And if we are all in it together, then we should be kind of collaborating and working a bit more effectively.
Yeah, and we talk a lot here about kind of a mindset shift towards buy versus build, like what the US government, the UK government can buy from the commercial sector versus needs to build itself. And I think we're at a really interesting kind of inflection point in that regard. You previously served as a chief of defense intelligence, and you were in that role when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. So while that is not your role today, although intelligence is part of what Stratcom does, I'd be remiss if not to ask you if you can share, from a kind of threat perspective at the beginning of the war, what do you think we got right? How did our assessments match or not match what we saw in terms of how the conflict started, and since obviously you've been very closely watching how the conflict has been evolved and fought on the ground. Would love to kind of hear your thoughts about what you can share about that, what surprised you, what didn't surprise you, and you talked about a couple of lessons that you're gleaning. Would love for you to maybe tie that in and elaborate a little bit more about kind of what lessons learned can be applied to different kinds of adversaries, different kinds of contexts.
Okay. So I was the Chief of Defence Intelligence from 2018 through to 2022 when I took over this particular role, and I think we got a number of things right, and we got some things wrong, and I think it's really important that we need to be kind of open and honest where we haven't been successful, because I think that's the way you learn. Yeah. What did we get right? So we pretty accurately predicted the time of the illegal invasion of Ukraine, down to a really quite tight window. There were some in all of our countries who didn't believe this was going to happen. But I think together with other intelligence leaders, particularly intelligence leaders here in the United States, were convinced that the information that we'd seen and the interpretation and analysis that we'd done and the assessment that we'd made was that the invasion was going to happen. And in some ways, it's brave is perhaps the wrong term, because the brave people are the Ukrainian, but it was a bold thing to say, we believe this invasion is coming, and this is when we think it's going to happen. To the point where on the 17th of February 2022, I sent out my first ever tweet. I'd never sent a tweet before. It's not because I'm a technical Luddite. I'm an intelligence officer. I really don't like being in the public domain, and today's even uncomfortable. But we tweeted out Putin's invasion plan, and we showed a series of red arrows over where we thought the force would go, and we pointed out that he still had time to change his mind. And a week later, he didn't change his mind. He invaded. But that idea of kind of using our intelligence in public information I think was a kind of watershed moment for us in the UK. And we continue to tweet, and still do to this day, about what we believe is happening in Ukraine. And there's something important about using our intelligence as a sort of purifying power to have the kind of transparency that kind of puts sunlight onto the lies, by getting the truth out there. It's very difficult once someone has lied to get that lie back in a box. It sort of creates a storm on Twitter that someone will pick up. Well, our attempt was to kind of forestall the Russian lies and make sure we were in the public domain. So I think we got the prediction right, and I think we got some of our actions right. I think, though, we underestimated two things. We underestimated the Western response. So when we thought about how quickly Russia would or wouldn't achieve its objectives, I think we were surprised, I think, at the way in which the entire Western world responded. And I think it's greatly to the credit of the world in how it did that, of the Western world. But that changed the calculus of some of the force ratios or some of the capabilities. I think we also we were guilty of a degree of overestimation of Russian capability. We knew we'd seen a lot on exercises, and we knew that much of that is a charade or a show. And we highlighted there are a range of challenges that Russia was going to face. It had never conducted an operation of this scale in kind of recent memory. So it was kind of commanding and controlling this sort of operation was going to be very difficult. We knew the logistic supplies were in bad shape. We knew that the engineering assets were sparse. There are a whole range of things they had against them, but we still thought they would do better than they actually proved to be. And I think, that's whilst I wasn't in the camp that thought that Ukraine would fall remarkably quickly against Russian aggression, I think many of us thought that the way in which Ukraine has been able to fight was kind of wonderfully surprising. I think since that time, actually, I think the intelligence community's done a remarkable job in understanding the conflict and focusing on what the kind of insights coming from the battlefield are, and making sure that we kind of understand Russian intent. And of course, one area that we constantly watch for is the possibility of escalation, and at times I think we've certainly focused on that a lot. Some people have thought that there'd be a greater chance of Russian escalation. I've been slightly in a place where I think Russia has got a variety of ways in which it could escalate its conflict before it starts to get to its nuclear capabilities. So I'm in the space where Russia, I think, is trying to fight a local war in order to achieve its particular objectives. That doesn't mean to say that's the end of its ambition, but I think we in overall terms of our intelligence assessment, I think we did a pretty good job up front. I think we overestimated Russian capability to a degree, and since the relatively early days of the campaign, I think we've been pretty good at being able to track what's happening on the battlefield.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights on that. We do a lot of work on this at the Atlantic Council. So we're a little bit over time, but I did want to kind of give you the opportunity for any kind of concluding thoughts from your side. What messages would you like to kind of leave our US audience?
So I think firstly is to say thank you. The leadership of the United States in a really difficult set of circumstances is fundamental to the security of the world, and all of us benefit as a consequence of the way in which the US has operated over the last few years, of the turbulence of the last few years. I think that's been fundamentally important. I've always found the U.S. military, and I've lived in the U.S. In both Kansas and California, and I've spent years on operations with U.S. partners over the last 20 years. And that sort of generosity of spirit doesn't just exist at the strategic level. I think it exists within my kind of experiences of working with the U.S. military. I suppose, having said thank you, the issue for me is to say, let's make sure that we kind of continue in that spirit, and we've got to stay together. And we've got, you know, NATO's 75th anniversary coming up. There are some wonderful opportunities, I think, to celebrate what we do, whilst also to kind of rededicate ourselves to the challenges that we face. And whilst there are, you know, those of us that are serving in uniform, or people that are in an enterprise that's supporting defence, it's a kind of privileged responsibility to undertake, but it also kind of lands us all with an obligation about how we keep the world to be the safe place that we need it to be for future generations, and we're only going to do that in partnership. And I think we should really celebrate the partnerships that we have, because that's the basis upon which I think our future depends.
General Sir Hockenhull, thank you so much for your time. We're so thrilled that we could host you during your very packed visit here. One of the many things that stand out from what you said to me is we can move faster alone but further together, which I think is a really important note to end on. So huge thanks to our audience, and please tune in again for our future events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.